In a version of American politics that feels only half fictional, the moment begins with a line that sounds almost polite, but lands like a warning bell. "Governor, I'd like you to meet someone," Vice President JD Vance says, his voice steady, controlled, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to command attention. He gestures toward the audience. Her name is Jennifer. Gavin Newsom pauses, just for a fraction of a second. But the cameras catch it anyway. The tiny break in rhythm that only shows up when someone realizes they've lost the script. He has no idea who Jennifer is, and neither do the millions of people watching at home. Which is exactly why the moment feels dangerous. The CNN town hall in Los Angeles is supposed to be a standard political event, a California crisis forum designed to generate debate without blowing anything up. It's October 23, 2025, and the lighting is harsh in that familiar television way that makes everyone look sharper, more dramatic, more exposed. Newsom has agreed to come on to defend his record, to answer tough questions about homelessness, crime, housing costs, and the steady stream of headlines about people leaving the state. What he didn't expect was that one of his most pointed critics would be the sitting vice president, and that the critique wouldn't stay in the realm of charts and sound bites. For nearly 2 hours, the exchange has felt like a long, controlled demolition. Newsom talks about innovation, about California as the 5th largest economy in the world, about climate leadership and progressive values. Vance responds with numbers, timelines, and documents, not so much arguing ideology as highlighting contradictions. It's tense, but familiar, the kind of political sparring audiences have been trained to expect. Then Vance changes the frame. He doesn't pivot to another policy. He pivots to a person. The camera finds Jennifer in the 7th row, left side of the audience. She stands slowly, looking smaller than the stage lights, thinner in a way that suggests exhaustion rather than fashion. Her clothes are clean but worn, the kind of outfit that doesn't draw attention unless you're already looking for it. When she speaks, her voice is quiet, almost fragile, but the microphones catch every word. "Governor, you don't know me," she says, "but I know you." Newsom's face shifts into the expression every politician learns early on, the careful blend of sympathy and concern that works in town halls and campaign stops. It doesn't work here. Jennifer explains that she used to live near his neighborhood in San Francisco, in Pacific Heights. She says she was a 5th-grade teacher in the Sunset District for 17 years, that she loved her job and her students. When the pandemic hit, she was furloughed, then laid off, and eventually evicted. By 2022, she says, she was sleeping on the streets. The room goes quiet in that uncomfortable way that feels less like silence and more like collective holding of breath. She talks about shelters that are full or unsafe, about hotlines and waiting lists that stretch into years, about pneumonia and stolen belongings. None of it is delivered as accusation, just as a sequence of experiences that sound too ordinary to be staged. Then she says something that shifts the energy in the room. She says she saw Newsom twice, once near his street, once near a restaurant in Napa. She doesn't claim he recognized her or knew her story, only that he looked at her and kept walking. It's not framed as wrongdoing, just as observation, but the implication hangs heavy in the air. The audience doesn't know what to do with it, because it's not a policy failure you can debate, and it's not a scandal you can verify in real time. It's a human moment, and those are harder to manage. Vance lets the silence stretch before he speaks again. He says Jennifer represents one of roughly 181,000 people experiencing homelessness in California, about 30% of the national total. He repeats the figure Newsom himself often cites, that the state has spent around $24 billion on homelessness programs over several years. He doesn't say the money was stolen or wasted, only asks what results it has produced and why someone like Jennifer still feels invisible within the system. She's not a statistic, he says. She's a person. It's the kind of line that sounds rehearsed until you realize it doesn't need rehearsal. Newsom finally responds, and this is where the moment turns. He says he's sorry for what Jennifer has been through, but adds that he can't personally recognize and solve every individual situation. On paper, it's a reasonable statement, even a true one. In the room, it lands badly. The audience gasps, not because the logic is wrong, but because the timing is. Jennifer doesn't look angry. She looks disappointed, which somehow feels worse. From a purely analytical perspective, nothing illegal has been alleged, nothing proven, nothing even formally accused. It's all framed through personal testimony, public spending figures, and rhetorical questions. And yet, the damage feels real, because the story has shifted from abstract governance to emotional credibility. The debate is no longer about whether California's policies are effective in theory. It's about whether the people implementing them seem connected to the lives they affect. Looking back, the setup becomes almost ironic. Earlier that day, Newsom had been in the green room, calm and confident, going over talking points with his team. The narrative was familiar. California leads in innovation. The problems are complex. Progress takes time. Vance, in another room, had been preparing in a very different way, surrounded by folders, charts, and timelines. One was expecting a debate. The other was preparing a case, not in the legal sense, but in the storytelling sense. Throughout the forum, Vance avoids direct accusations and instead relies on contrast. He mentions the cost of supportive housing units, not to claim corruption, but to question efficiency. He brings up the famous French Laundry dinner during the pandemic, not as a crime, but as a symbol of perceived hypocrisy. He references private jet travel, not to allege wrongdoing, but to highlight the gap between climate rhetoric and personal behavior. Each point is presented as a question. How does this align with the values being promoted? How does this look to the average person struggling to pay rent? The education segment hits a similar note. Newsom defends public schools and opposes voucher programs, while Vance points out that Newsom's own children attend a private school. Again, no accusation, just an observation that feels awkward on camera. Vance doesn't say Newsom is wrong to choose private education for his family. He asks why other families shouldn't have similar choices. It's the kind of argument that works not because it's airtight, but because it resonates emotionally. By the time Jennifer speaks, the audience has already been primed to see patterns rather than isolated incidents. Her story becomes a kind of narrative glue, binding together the statistics and anecdotes into something more visceral. It's not that anyone suddenly proves anything, it's that the contradictions become easier to see and harder to ignore. What makes the moment so powerful is that it stays within the realm of implication. No one says Newsom is corrupt. No one claims he committed any crime. The critique lives entirely in tone, context, and comparison. This is political commentary at its most effective, not because it convicts, but because it unsettles. It forces viewers to ask their own questions. If billions are being spent, why do people like Jennifer still feel abandoned? If leaders speak about sacrifice, how do their personal choices shape public trust? If policies are well-intentioned, but outcomes remain bleak, where does accountability actually live? After the forum, the clips spread quickly, not because they contain shocking revelations, but because they contain something rarer. An unscripted, emotional exchange that feels authentic. Newsom's approval ratings dip in some polls, commentators on all sides dissect the moment, and Jennifer becomes a symbol, whether she wanted to or not. Some see her as a brave truth-teller. Others see her as a powerful anecdote that shouldn't substitute for policy analysis. Both interpretations can coexist, and that's what makes the story durable. From my perspective, the most interesting part isn't whether Newsom lost the debate or whether Vance won it. It's how easily political narratives collapse when they collide with lived experience. We spend so much time arguing over numbers and budgets that we forget how much public trust depends on perception. A single sentence, delivered at the wrong moment, can undo years of careful branding. It also raises uncomfortable questions about modern political theater. Was Jennifer's appearance spontaneous or carefully planned? Does that even matter if her story is genuine? At what point does emotional storytelling become manipulation? And at what point does it become necessary to cut through abstract policy talk? These aren't questions with clean answers, and that's precisely why the moment lingers. There's a subtle irony in how both men approach the debate. Newsom leans on complexity, on the idea that problems are too big for simple solutions. Vance leans on simplicity, on the idea that outcomes matter more than intentions. One frames politics as management of systems, the other as accountability for results. Jennifer's presence disrupts both frames, because she doesn't fit neatly into either. She isn't a statistic, but she also isn't a policy solution. She's just a person telling a story that makes everyone uncomfortable. In the end, what makes the exchange so compelling is not any single claim, but the accumulation of unresolved tension. Nothing is definitively settled. No verdict is delivered. There's only the image of a governor struggling to respond to a personal story, and a vice president using that struggle to challenge a broader narrative. It's politics as moral theater, where credibility is tested not by courts or audits, but by the reactions of a live audience. And maybe that's the real lesson. In an era where facts are endlessly contested and trust in institutions is fragile, the most powerful political moments aren't always about evidence. They're about empathy, timing, and the ability to connect abstract policy to human consequence. Newsom didn't necessarily say anything objectively wrong, but he said it at a moment when the room needed something else, and in politics, that's often enough to change everything. Whether this moment truly destroyed anything is debatable. Political careers have survived far worse than awkward town halls. But as a piece of political storytelling, it worked precisely because it avoided definitive accusations. It left viewers with questions instead of conclusions, and those questions linger longer than any headline. Did the system fail Jennifer? Or did Jennifer's story simply expose how hard it is to measure success in public policy? Did Newsom walk past her as an individual, or as a symbol of a problem too big for one person to fix? And in a democracy obsessed with optics, does perception ultimately matter more than intent? Those questions don't have easy answers, and maybe that's why the exchange feels so unsettling. It doesn't end with a scandal or a confession. It ends with silence, disappointment, and the sense that something important was revealed without ever being fully explained. In modern politics, that kind of ambiguity can be more damaging than any direct accusation, because it invites everyone to fill in the gaps themselves. The silence after the closing statements didn't feel like the usual TV wrap-up silence, the kind where people shuffle and clap because they're supposed to. It felt like the silence you get when a room realizes it just watched something that can't be neatly edited into a highlight reel without changing what it meant. Dana Bash thanked everyone with the practiced cadence of a moderator trying to reattach normalcy to an event that had drifted out of her hands. Newsom offered a quick nod, the kind that reads as polite on camera but looks like retreat in person. Vance didn't smile, didn't gloat, just watched the audience like he was measuring what had landed and what hadn't. Backstage, the energy changed instantly the moment the cameras cut away. Newsom's team moved in around him like a protective shell, whispering, tapping phones, scanning the room for friendly faces and friendly exits. Someone asked if he wanted to do a quick spin with CNN afterward, a short, context interview to smooth the edges and reset the narrative. He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told you more than any quote could. Vance's team, by contrast, looked less like they'd won and more like they'd completed a planned operation, calm and already transitioning to the next step. Jennifer didn't get swarmed by handlers in the same way, and that was part of what made the moment feel raw. A producer asked if she'd do a short follow-up interview for the digital stream, and she hesitated like someone who wasn't sure whether she'd said too much or not enough. She wasn't performing victory, she was processing exposure. A few audience members approached her, quietly, some with tears, some with that awkward intensity people get when they feel compelled to confess their own stories. In a corner, a CNN staffer offered her water and asked if she needed anything, and for a second the whole thing looked less like politics and more like basic human triage. Outside the studio, the social media clip machine was already working like it always does, but it wasn't working evenly. The clip of Jennifer describing the two encounters circulated first, not because it was the most damning, but because it was the most watchable without context. It didn't require charts or policy knowledge, just ears and a pulse. Then the second clip took over. Newsom's line about not being able to solve every individual situation. It wasn't a shocking sentence, but it was a sentence that sounded different once it was detached from his longer explanation. If you've watched enough American politics, you know how this usually goes next. The defenses arrive in predictable order. First, the insistence that the moment was out of context, then the claim it was staged, then the pivot to bigger issues, then the request for everyone to stay focused. None of those defenses are automatically wrong, and that's what makes this kind of moment so slippery. Politics is full of edited storylines and strategic framing, and every side does it. But the problem with a human story like Jennifer's is that it doesn't need to be perfectly verified in real time to change how people feel. Within an hour, pundits were already doing the thing pundits do, arguing about what it really meant. Some framed Jennifer as a symbol of failed governance, proof that big spending doesn't necessarily translate into real outcomes. Others argued she was being used, that her pain had become a tool in a larger power fight she didn't start. Both interpretations can exist at once, and that's the uncomfortable truth viewers rarely hear said out loud. People can be real and still be used by real politics at the same time. Newsom's team didn't treat it as a policy debate anymore, not privately. They treated it like a brand crisis, because in American politics, brand is often the real battlefield. The first internal question wasn't, what do we do differently? But, how do we stop this from defining the next month? That's not uniquely cynical. It's how modern campaigns and administrations are trained to react when a clip starts outrunning the full story. The second question, quietly, was harder. Do we have an answer that feels like an answer? Because the obvious rebuttal, I can't personally solve every case, is also the honest rebuttal. No governor can personally fix homelessness for every resident, and pretending otherwise would be ridiculous. The issue wasn't logic, it was the emotional mismatch between the human story and the political reflex. In that moment, the audience wasn't grading him on competence, they were grading him on presence. And presence, for better or worse, is something voters can feel even when they can't explain it. Vance's people understood that, which is why they kept their language carefully on the edge of accusation without stepping into it. They didn't claim criminality. They didn't claim secret schemes. They didn't say, "This money was stolen," or "This person is evil." They just stacked contrasts. Big numbers, visible suffering, elite behaviors, and a question mark at the end of every implication. Where did it go? Is a different sentence than "someone took it," and the difference matters. It invites the viewer to conclude rather than instructing them what to believe. By midnight, the conversation had split into 3 tracks that rarely talked to each other. Track 1 was pure outrage, the people who saw Jennifer and decided the entire system is rigged and nothing will ever change. Track 2 was pure skepticism, the people who decided the whole thing was a setup and refused to engage with the underlying issue. Track 3 was the quiet middle, the people who didn't know what to think but couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been revealed. That third group is usually the most consequential because they're the ones who can still be moved. They don't need to be convinced of a conspiracy. They just need to believe the disconnect is real. The next morning, Newsom's office released a statement that read like it had been run through 3 lawyers and 2 communications consultants. It expressed sympathy for Jennifer, recommitted to evidence-based solutions, and stressed the complexity of homelessness and housing costs. It emphasized ongoing investments, partnerships, and progress indicators without naming specific numbers that could be contested in the next news cycle. It was safe, polished, and strategically cautious. And the problem with safe statements after an unsafe moment is that they often make the moment feel even more true. Meanwhile, Jennifer's name became a kind of shorthand online, which is always a weird and unfair thing to do to a person. Strangers argued about her credibility without knowing her, debated her motives without asking her, and built entire narratives around her face. Some people wanted her to be a saint, others wanted her to be a pawn, and neither role left room for her to just be complicated. That's one of the hidden cruelties of viral politics. It turns real people into symbols, and symbols don't get privacy. If you're looking for a reason public trust keeps eroding, start there. In a more grounded conversation, the questions would get specific fast. What exactly does $24 billion include? Over what time period? And how much of it is state spending versus local or federal pass-through? How many housing units were built? How many people were placed? How long did placements last? And what metrics define success? How much of the cost is driven by construction, permitting, litigation risk, environmental review, staffing, security, or supportive services? And if the system is truly that complex, why are so many ordinary people convinced it's also that ineffective? Those questions aren't partisan, and they're not personal attacks. They're the kind of questions you'd ask any government spending that large, any place, any time, especially when the visible outcomes don't match the scale of the investment. They're also the kind of questions that get dodged, because the answers are messy, and the mess doesn't fit on a Chiron. Messy answers don't go viral, but messy realities still shape lives. Jennifer's story, in that sense, wasn't a conclusion, it was an entry point. 2 days after the forum, CNN hosted a panel to discuss what happened, and you could tell even the professionals were uneasy. They tried to frame it as a clash of styles, as a moment that resonated, as a high-stakes exchange. But beneath the TV language was a more basic fear, that viewers might start asking why politics feels more like performance than problem-solving. The panelists used words like optics and narrative and messaging, which is exactly what Americans have grown tired of hearing. When the public starts hearing optics, They start translating it into, "You care more about looking good than doing good." Newsom did a radio interview later that week where he tried to reset. He spoke more plainly, less polished, emphasizing that homelessness is driven by housing scarcity, mental health, addiction, and economic shocks. He acknowledged that programs can be inefficient, that reforms are slow, and that California's scale makes everything harder. He said he felt for Jennifer and that no one should have to live like that. It was better, but the clip wasn't going to disappear just because he sounded better later. Because that's the catch with modern media. The first emotional impression becomes the anchor. Everything that comes afterward gets measured against it, and if it feels like retroactive repair, people reject it even if it's true. This is why politicians dread unscripted moments more than hard questions. A hard question can be answered with preparation. An unscripted human moment forces you to be a person in real time. And being a person on camera is harder than reading a policy memo. Behind the scenes, you can almost predict what happened next in both camps. Newsom's team likely started building a counter-story. Visits to shelters, meetings with service providers, new announcements, new initiatives, a show of urgency. Vance's team likely started building amplification. More clips, more interviews, more framing around accountability and results. Neither approach is inherently evil. Both are the language of American politics now. The question is whether any of it changes outcomes or just changes headlines. That's where the cynicism comes from, and it's not entirely irrational. If you want the most honest takeaway, it's this. Jennifer's story didn't prove anything, but it made it harder to ignore what people already suspect. A government can spend a mountain of money and still fail the human beings it's supposed to serve. A leader can say the reasonable thing and still sound disconnected, because the reasonable thing isn't always the human thing. A critic can use a real story responsibly or irresponsibly, and it's often the viewer who decides which one they're watching. And once that kind of doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave easily. The forum didn't end California's problems, and it didn't settle the argument about how to fix them. But it did something that's rarer than people admit. It made the conversation feel personal without needing to turn into a direct accusation. It forced the audience to sit with a question that has no clean partisan answer. If the system is working, why does it still look like this for so many people who did everything right? And if the system isn't working, who has the courage to say so without turning it into another performance? By the end of that week, the story had stopped feeling like a single event and started feeling like a slow leak in the walls of public trust. Not an explosion, not a scandal in the traditional sense, just a steady drip of doubt that refused to be patched with press releases. Every new interview, every follow-up segment, every opinion column seemed to circle the same question without quite saying it out loud. If leadership is about outcomes, not intentions, then what exactly counts as success anymore? And who gets to define it when the people living the consequences feel left out of the definition? What made the moment linger wasn't outrage, it was discomfort. Outrage burns hot and fast, then moves on to the next target. Discomfort stays, because it doesn't give you an easy villain or an easy hero. Viewers weren't being asked to hate Newsom, and they weren't being asked to worship Vance. They were being asked to sit with a contradiction that looked uncomfortably familiar. The contradiction was simple enough to describe and almost impossible to resolve. California presents itself as the future, a place of innovation, compassion, and moral leadership. At the same time, it struggles with visible suffering that seems immune to massive spending and endless programs. That gap between branding and lived experience is where trust quietly erodes, not through scandal, but through the feeling that the story being told doesn't match the street outside. Jennifer didn't become famous because she accused anyone of anything. She became famous because she asked a question that had no clean answer. Where does the money go if people like her never see it? Why does a system designed to help feel invisible to the people it's supposed to serve? And how many layers of policy does a human life have to pass through before it counts as data? For Newsom, the challenge wasn't disproving her story. It was finding a way to respond that didn't sound like management language in a moment that demanded something more human. Every explanation about complexity, scale, and long-term strategy was logically defensible. None of it addressed the emotional reality that millions of viewers had just internalized. That's the danger of emotional moments in politics. They don't wait for nuance to catch up. For Vance, the risk ran in the opposite direction. The more effective the story became, the easier it would be for critics to say it crossed from commentary into theater. Even real experiences can start to feel instrumental when they're used to make a point on national television. The line between exposing a problem and exploiting a symbol is thin and constantly shifting. And once that question appears, it never fully disappears. What lingered most wasn't any specific statistic or quote. It was the sense that modern politics is trapped between two languages that no longer translate. One language speaks in budgets, programs, frameworks, and strategic plans. The other speaks in stories, faces, and moments that don't fit into spreadsheets. The failure happens when leaders only speak the first language and citizens are forced to live in the second. Nothing about the forum resolved homelessness, or even clarified how to fix it, but it revealed something deeper about how credibility now works. It's not built on expertise alone, and it's not destroyed by mistakes alone. It rises or falls on whether people believe the person in power actually sees them. Not as numbers, not as narratives, but as real lives happening just outside the frame.